Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Asian Carp Canada webinar. My name is Rebecca Schroeder, and I work on the Asian Carp program at the Invasive Species Center, and I will be your moderator today. So there's a couple of items I wanted to touch on before we get started. The first is that following the webinar, there will be time for questions. So if at any time you think of a question, please type it into the question box, and following the webinar, I will read it out loud to our speakers and they can answer. If you are having any issues at all during the webinar, you can write them in the chat box and we will do our best to try and resolve them for you. Lastly, there will be a brief survey at the end of the webinar. If you could take a few minutes to fill it out, that would be greatly appreciated. Today's webinar is titled The Importance of Binational Collaboration in the Great Lakes Region to Address Asian Carps. I am pleased to introduce our speakers, Becky Cudmore and Dr. Marc Gaden. Dr. Marc Gaden grew up in southeastern Michigan and has spent most of his professional career working to protect and improve the Great Lakes. He serves as Communications Director and Legislative Liaison for the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, a U.S.-Canadian agency established by treaty to improve and perpetuate the Great Lakes fishery. He has held this position since 1995. He has worked extensively on issues involving regional coordination of fisheries policies, invasive species, and ecosystem restoration. Prior to joining the Great Lakes Fishery Commission Secretariat, Dr. Gaden worked as a legislative assistant for the U.S. House of Representatives Great Lakes Task Force, researching, proposing, and advocating legislation of benefit to the Great Lakes region. Dr. Gaden also worked as a legislative assistant and caseworker for U.S. Congressman Dennis M. Hurdle, specializing in Great Lakes, environment, transportation, immigration, and social security issues. Dr. Gaden is an adjunct assistant professor at the School of Natural Resources and Environment, University of Michigan, and an adjunct associate professor at the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, Michigan State University. He teaches courses in environmental and water policy and has written about environmental governance, Great Lakes policy, and cooperative fishery management. Currently, he teaches the course Global Water at the University of Michigan. He received a PhD from the University of Michigan's School of Natural Resources and Environment in 2007, a Master of Arts degree in the United States Foreign Policy from the American University in 1993, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Political Science from the University of Michigan in 1991. Becky Cudmore is our next speaker, and she is no stranger to the Asian Carp Canada webinar series. She's the Regional Manager for Fisheries and Oceans Canada's Aquatic Invasive Species Program for the Department's Central and Arctic region, which covers Ontario, the Prairies, and the Arctic. This program includes the Asian Carp Program for the Great Lakes. Becky has a postgraduate degree in zoology from the University of Toronto and a joint undergraduate degree in biology and environmental science from Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. Becky has worked on aquatic invasive species in the International Great Lakes for almost 20 years and was the recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Award for her contributions and efforts to protect the Great Lakes from aquatic invasive species. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to our speakers.
Mark, I'm going to get you to switch to the next slide. Okay. And I think there'll be some slight delay here, folks, as we let technology catch up with us. So I'd like to start off with this, and the reason why we put this together is because this is a serious question we get a lot in Canada. So for a variety of reasons, why not just have the U.S. deal with Asian carp? And so while this is hilarious and funny for us in our program, we do recognize that this is not the direction we want to take, and we do want to highlight today, Mark and I, the importance of binational cooperation with respect to the Asian carp issue in the Great Lakes. Next slide. And we're going to walk you through a few things and some examples. We're going to talk just really quickly about the Asian carp threat to the binational Great Lakes. Mark's going to also provide some overview of the governance within the binational Great Lakes with respect to fishery management authorities, and specifically get into some of the governance surrounding Asian carp species specifically. I'm going to provide some examples of some coordinated actions that are occurring on the ground, well, both Mark and I will, in terms of those actions that are supported directly by the ACRCC, some general Great Lakes actions, and we're going to talk a little bit specifically on grass carp and the work being done in Lake Erie on a binational level, and as well highlight the importance of binational collaboration with respect to law enforcement. At the end, Marc's going to present on the challenges and opportunities with respect to binational cooperation in the Great Lakes with respect to Asian carp. Next slide.
Okay. Yep. Thank you, Becky. So this slide is a good illustration of if it will advance. It is a little slow here. Let's see. There we go. I'd like to start with this when we talk about invasive species because it puts in perspective that Mother Nature did provide the Great Lakes with a couple of safeguards against invasive species, both of which have been breached. The Niagara Falls, of course, is quite a significant barrier to the movement of species from Lake Ontario into all the lakes above. And then outside, almost just barely outside the city limits of the city of Chicago is a subcontinental divide, not a very big one, but a divide nevertheless, that naturally separated the Great Lakes from the Mississippi River basin. And it's this divide, the breaching of that divide, that is probably where the most attention is with Asian carp, because the pathway from the Mississippi into the Great Lakes Basin is through a Chicago area waterway system. So as Becky and I talk, keep in mind the fact that there were these natural divides, and the breaching of them is why invasive species become a problem. We have a $7 billion fishery. I work for the Fishery Commission, so the fishery interests, of course, motivate us quite substantially here. It's a fishery that's enjoyed by millions of Canadians and Americans. It's lucrative, supports jobs and charter fishing and native communities. We also care about the health of the fish themselves and the ecosystem. So some of the things that really motivate us collectively in the Great Lakes fishery world is not just the economic value, but the ecological contributions of fish to the system, and why it's important to keep a balance and some sort of semblance, really, of naturalness to the system. Invasive species disrupt that. They hurt us not only in the pocketbook, but also ecologically. Managing the fishery is a complex task because of the fact that there are 100 and maybe 50 native species and about the same number of non-native species in the system. But it's also a governance challenge. We keep in mind that managing fish over ecosystems as large as each of the Great Lakes, and then as an ecosystem as a whole, is a complex issue. So is working together across borders, and there are a lot of borders in the Great Lakes Basin, especially on the American side. 2 federal governments, 8 states, 2 provinces, numerous tribes and indigenous communities, First Nations, non-government organizations are engaged, stakeholders, industries, and lots of others, which means that anything that we do with respect to fishery management or invasive species control or prevention has to take into account the fact that people move, fish move, and these are resources that are shared. Power is distributed, and authority to do things among many jurisdictions. So with that as a brief background, let me turn it over to Becky for just a little bit about Asian carp and why they're such a problem, and then I'll get back into it talking about governance.
Helps if I take it off mute. Thanks, Marc. So Asian carps, we are referring to 4 species in this presentation when we say Asian carps. So collectively, the bighead, silver, black, and grass carp. There has been risk assessments done on these species to identify the threats they pose, how they would get here, what damage they might have upon establishment, how quickly they would spread. And the reason why these risk assessments are being done is we are trying to protect the Great Lakes from some of these species. So bighead, silver, black carp are currently not in the Great Lakes Basin in numerous in numbers, but they are in the Mississippi River Basin, and we'd like to keep it that way. For grass carp, a little bit further ahead in the invasion process, they have been deemed to have arrived in Lakes Michigan, Erie, and Ontario, but while there's evidence of reproduction, there is not evidence of establishment of these species. So if you think about that invasion curve that all invasive species take, they have to arrive, survive, establish, spread, and have an impact. Grass carp have arrived to these 3 lakes. They haven't arrived to the other lakes yet. So they're definitely further on in the invasion process than the 3 other Asian carp species. And some of the threats that have been predicted are, for the bighead and silver carp, they've been deemed high risk, especially to the central lakes, Michigan, Huron, and Erie. And the risk assessment work that has been done highlighted that increased actions would be required to prevent, especially establishment. And in doing so, we would be able to delay the potential impacts that bighead and silver carps would have on the Great Lakes ecosystem. For grass carp, again, predicted to have high potential impacts, and really specifically looked at different fish and bird species that would be impacted by loss of habitat or directly or through direct competition. And it was found that 33 fish and 18 bird species would suffer high consequences should grass carp establish in the Great Lakes. Again, it was recommended that immediate preventative actions would be the most effective, especially in conjunction with control activities where grass carp have arrived, and that would reduce the probability of establishment and delay or reduce those subsequent ecological consequences that are expected. Next slide.
So Becky talked quite a bit about the risk and why we're concerned, and she led a team that did some risk assessments. Another succinct way of saying it is we got a warning from the folks of the Mississippi region, MICRA. It's an organization of Mississippi River states that suffered the Asian carp invasion, and they simply warned us. This was back in the late 1990s. We got them, you don't want them. And as we watched in horror as these fish made their way ever northward in the Mississippi River system and what they did to the system, that became very true. We mobilized really in the late 1990s, early 2000s to begin some defensive work on it. I'm going to describe that. I'm also going to describe really Asian carp response in 2 different ways. One is prevention, and the other is in the actual management. And that becomes important, especially in light of the governance slide that I put up a few minutes ago. So you see this map again, just keep this in mind, because efforts at prevention and efforts at management are, they have objectives, of course, of 1, keeping Asian carp out of the Great Lakes, or 2, keeping Asian carp contained or not letting them be established. But in some cases, is a different set of players, and that does affect how the work is done. So first, I'll talk a little bit about prevention, and I'll just say this is all hands on deck. When I mean all hands on deck, it's any government agency or any NGO that has some role to play. Industry should be playing a role in this. The primary objective in Asian carp right now is focused on the Chicago area waterway system. That's in the lower, where the yellow star is on the diagram. That's because it's a man-made canal that connects Lake Michigan to the Des Plaines River, which connects to the Illinois River, which connects to the Mississippi River. And these Asian carp are quite abundant up those river systems. If they get in to the Great Lakes, according to the studies, it's most likely through this pathway, and that's where the focus has been. One of the issues with respect to when I say all hands on deck is the fact that, as these logos show, prevention is something that everybody has a role to play in. And these are emblems of various agencies that have some role to play, and they range from federal agencies like the U.S. Coast Guard and the Army Corps, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and EPA, and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, to state agencies that are shown here. Each of the Great Lakes states and Ontario and Quebec play roles in that. Then there are other entities like the City of Chicago or the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. The issue is that unlike lamprey control, which is under the responsibility of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, There is no one agency that has the responsibility to stop Asian carp. It is, you know, a little bit here, a little bit there. One agency has control, say, over the locks, and another, say, like the Fish and Wildlife Service, does very important work on the science behind it and removal. But no one entity has that accountability. That's, in some respects, a problem because it's diffuse authority and it makes it difficult to really concentrate an effort. On the other hand, it's a great strength because we have a lot of competency and a lot of folks then who can bring tools to the table to actually work on the prevention part. So to bring some cohesion to this, President Obama formed what was called and is called the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee. This is a group of those agencies that I showed on the previous slide with the emblems that have gotten together and said we need to have some cohesion to what we do and make it very clear on what we're doing. The person on the left of the three photos is John Goss, who served as the head of the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee, the staff for that for some time, and is now a very active player still in these in Asian carp prevention. The two other gentlemen, the one in the middle is Bill Boland. He's the current co-chair of the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee with the EPA, and Mike Weimer on the right with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the other co-chair. This is very capable leadership. These individuals have taken a very strong interest in not only trying to prevent Asian carp from moving into the Great Lakes, but then helping to corral the various entities that are engaged in this to make sure that we're all marching in that direction. And I feel personally very fortunate that this entity, the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee, with the leadership we have, has existed because it has really kept these fish out of the Great Lakes as far as I'm concerned. More along the lines of prevention then is the various documents and plans that exist that keep everybody accountable to what they can and should be doing for Asian carp. The big one is the one on the left, on the right there, the Asian Carp Action Plan. This is probably the many iterations of this plan. So this is the 2018 version of the plan. What the Asian Carp Action Plan does is it basically outlines who's engaged in Asian carp management, who has the responsibility to do what with Asian carp, what resources do they have, and what are they going to do. So if anybody is interested in seeing this plan, it's on the website asiancarp.us, and the folks can read for themselves what they do there. The Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the province of Ontario and province of Quebec also have roles to play that are mentioned in that plan. There's a monitoring and response plan. So the Fishery Commission and the state of Illinois co-chair a group that actively monitors what's going on and then has contingency plans in place so that if these fish are seen where they shouldn't be, the actions that must be taken are already outlined in the plan and for all intents and purposes pre-approved. There was a plan, a study done by the Great Lakes Commission and the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative that asked the question, is it possible to restore that natural divide, that subcontinental divide? And that plan outlined some reasons why the answer to that is yes and why it should be done. And then probably the biggest and most important study that was done is called GLMRIS, the Great Lakes Mississippi River Interbasin Study, that's shown on the left there of the three documents. GLMRIS was authorized by Congress with the goal of identifying the range of options that would prevent the movement of species between the two basins. So it wasn't just about Asian carp, and it wasn't just about keeping fish out of the Great Lakes. It was, how do you keep the nasty things from the Great Lakes from going to the Mississippi and vice versa? That plan did provide a lot of options from doing nothing to separation. And the spin-off of that plan that I'm going to talk about in just a bit is the Brandon Road plan. And a lot of the people on the webinar have probably not only heard about Brandon Road, but also realized that it's back in the news right now because of the fact that the Brandon Road plan is out there for comment. Brandon Road is a lock and dam structure that is quite a bit downstream from Lake Michigan, and it was mentioned in the Glimmers report as the most likely place, or at least a place of low-hanging fruit where some intervention can be done on the canal, on the waterway, that could be effective in preventing the movement of the species. And so Glimmers Brandon Road is basically a spin-off study of the large Glimmers report. What does it do? Again, this is out for comment now up until, I believe, December 24th. The Glimmers Brandon Road report suggests that stuff can be done at Brandon Road from a non-structural perspective. In other words, there are non-structural measures that can take place. That would be things like monitoring or the application of pesticide if necessary, netting, and then structural measures as well at this lock and dam structure that could be geared specifically to the prevention of the movement of invasive species. Those are acoustics and electrical dispersal barriers, things that would deter the fish from moving in. An engineered channel that would allow for the easy netting of invasive species, or provide a place where these fish can't hide, and a unique thing called a flushing lock, which for all intents and purposes prevents the actual exchange of river water between the upstream and the downstream. This was just released about a week ago, I want to say, and it is open for public comment. The intent is to have the feasibility report, which is the final report, submitted in early 2019. It gets handed over to the U.S. Congress then for authorization, and I put with an exclamation point, funding, because of course it's contingent on there being funding for it. And the Army Corps estimates that the Brandon Road project could be completed by 2027. And then moving along on the management side, so that's the prevention. Management is then becomes, if a fish is in the Great Lakes, in other words, as opposed to prevention, which is not yet in the Great Lakes, there are management issues that the states and the province and the tribes and with support from the federal jurisdictions will undertake. So it becomes a management issue. For the most part, management of Great Lakes fisheries occurs at the non-federal level. It's state responsibilities. It's the responsibility of the tribes and the province of Ontario. And these are the day-to-day management decisions that are made with things regarding harvest and gear and law enforcement and the like. But there is quite a bit of important federal support as well with that and science and hatcheries and the like. That means, however, that fish that are in the lake are handled differently than the effort to take place to prevent the fish. It becomes much more of an exercise of state and provincial and tribal engagement to do that. So that means there also has to be certain structures in place to govern across borders, because you remember that map I put up, we have an awful lot of borders in the Great Lakes in terms of federal, non-federal cooperation here. I got one slide ahead of myself here, and I'm not sure. I can go back. Okay. So we do have a long history of engagement across borders, starting primarily in the 1950s and 60s, after a very long era of not working across borders. We have structures in place to help that happen. We're also lucky in that the management agencies generally share underlying principles and approaches to management, and that's not always been the case, but today it is. There's a collaboration that occurs that leads to a common purpose and a clear definition of why we're concerned. How do we reach consensus in managing, and what are the roles that we each have to carry out our agreed objectives? All this happens by respecting individual jurisdictional authority, but also at the same time recognizing the fact that there are shared objectives that we all have. And that's how governance happens with fishery management, including the management then of invasive species that come into the system. One mechanism, the major mechanism where this is done, is through what's called the Joint Strategic Plan for Management of Great Lakes Fisheries, and that supports a lake committee process. The short end of it is there's a committee for each lake that manages. There's a council of lake committees that is composed of all members of the lake committees, Council of Great Lakes Fishery Agencies made up of the head of the fisheries divisions and federal agencies. And I'll draw your attention as well to a relatively newcomer, an invasive fishes committee, which is a high-level committee to help the jurisdictions work together on invasive fishes. To give you kind of one idea of how management occurs, I'll focus just real briefly on the Lake Erie Committee, where a lot of cooperative work has been done on Asian carp. The participants work together in not only identifying their shared objectives, but then strategically coming up with ways that they can carry out those to reach those objectives. And this gets into things like tactical decisions. What's the allowable catch, or how much should be stocked? What are the accountability for the agencies, Ontario, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York? What do we owe to each other? This will come to play when Becky gets into some of the cooperative things that have taken place, but keep this structure in mind here. And with that, let me turn it over to Becky, who can talk a little bit now about some of the coordinated actions that have occurred over Asian carp within the context of that governance milieu that I talked about.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think we always use that refresher on getting the lay of the land in terms of governance with respect to fisheries management, invasive species prevention, as well as invasive species management. So appreciate that refresher from somebody who's worked on the Great Lakes for 20 years. It's always helpful to get that perspective. So as Mark said, yeah, moving on into examples of previous or ongoing binational actions with respect to Asian carp. There's a lot out there, and in this 40-minute webinar, we're just really going to brush the surface on some of these examples. Some of the examples include conducting those ecological risk assessments, some of the results that I alluded to at the beginning of the webinar. Work that's being done under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. In 2012, there was a new annex added to this binational agreement that was first signed in 1972, and that annex was specific to aquatic invasive species, recognizing the importance of the topic as well as the need to work binationally. I'll talk a little bit about the mutual aid agreement, and then maybe dive down into some very specific examples with respect to one of the Asian carp species, grass carp, on the structured decision-making process, and some on-water activities as well. I'm going to flip it over to Mark to talk about the law enforcement activities as well. So next slide. So some of the coordinated actions, we have had a long history of binational work in the Great Lakes, and notwithstanding the very successful sea lamprey control program. But this was one of the big topics that I first got involved with as part of my job with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and that was to do a binational risk assessment for Asian carp species. And we've developed a really good process and protocol taking into account two different countries' systems. So the risk that we were first approached by DFO actually to do a risk assessment, as our federal government was wondering, are these species a risk, and should we be doing anything about it? And the question posed was really about Canadian waters, and my colleague and I at the time thought we really can't be looking at this in terms of Canadian versus American waters. We really need the scope of the risk assessment to be binational. And so we geographically scoped the risk assessment to be a binational Great Lakes Basin, and we asked for the writing team to be binational as well. So we brought colleagues in from various agencies in both Canada and the U.S., as well as representatives from the different management agencies from all the jurisdictions that Marc was talking about, to begin helping us to further scope the risk assessment. What were the needs? What were some of the questions that managers wanted to get out of this? And we also highlighted what research needed to be done and who was going to do that. And those researchers came from both Canada and the U.S. Always a fun job is doing a peer review with just one federal government. In here, we got to do two. So these documents are very well peer reviewed by being put through absolutely two very rigorous federal government processes, one through the U.S. Geological Survey and one through Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And so the actual deliverables have been, in 2011, was a binational ecological risk assessment for Bighead and silver carp. In 2017, we released a binational risk assessment for grass carp. And while I was sad to hand over the crown to someone else to take on the black carp risk assessment, I really wanted to say I did them all. But at this point in time, while the author team is absolutely neck deep in documents and presentations, I can say I'm very happy I'm not doing this particular risk assessment. It's a lot of work, and but that black carp risk assessment should be out in 2019. I mentioned the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement has a new annex as of 2012. There we go. And the idea was to establish a binational strategy. So this is very much recognizing the importance of working binationally in a strategic way to prevent the introduction of aquatic invasive species, to control or reduce the spread of existing aquatic invasive species, and to eradicate, where feasible, those aquatic invasive species within the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem, again, on that geographic scope being binational. So under this, there were a few tasks laid out, including conducting those coordinated risk assessments on pathways, so not just on the species, developing regulations or strategies, management strategies, and coordinating implementation in order to achieve the goals of the annex, to develop and implement early detection and response initiatives on a binational level, coordinating and collaborating on education and outreach efforts, as well as establishing barriers to prevent the spread, and interbasin transfer of water that would carry, that those interbasin transfers of water should consider the risk of aquatic invasive species. So all of this is being done at a binational level. Next slide. And relatively recent deliverable that stemmed from the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, but is its own separate entity as well. But it does meet that one deliverable of establishing coordinated efforts for response to aquatic invasive species, is the mutual aid agreement, with the goal to stop that further introduction and spread of aquatic invasive species into the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. And this is a product from the yet another governance level, the Conference of Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers Aquatic Invasive Species Task Force that was established in 2001. And they've had some great products that have come out of this task force, including a least wanted list for the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River, which is a great communication tool. They are working on harmonizing the species risk assessments from around the Great Lakes Basin. And really the highlight deliverable of this group is this mutual aid agreement. And it's a formal agreement for state and provincial agencies to act collaboratively and share staff and expertise when requested due to a response of an aquatic invasive species threat. So if one jurisdiction at the state or provincial level is dealing with a response to an aquatic invasive species and needs the help of the other jurisdiction, this agreement allows for that formal request to go through, and the other signed authorities to the agreement have agreed to help out. The next step, the next slide. With respect to one of the species, so grass carp, as I mentioned earlier, grass carp is a little further in its invasion process than the other species of Asian carp. They have been deemed to have arrived in lakes ERIE, Michigan, and Ontario. And as I mentioned, there is known reproduction of this species in the Sandusky River since 2012. There's been a lot of questions on when, how, where to best take action to the benefit of the entire Great Lakes Basin. As you can imagine, with a threat that's facing the Great Lakes, it's important that we be as successful as possible. We do have limited resources around the basin, and we want to make sure that the action taken is going to help. And so answering these questions has been difficult in making those management decisions on what to do and where to do it. So in order to help decide on the best course of action for grass carp in the western basin of Lake Erie, a structured decision-making process was implemented through the Michigan State University. And it's a process that's very logical, and it's facilitated with experts and managers around the room to help decide to make sure that you all are on the same page with respect to the common goals, to what actions could be taken, what alternatives are out there, and what, in the end, what course of action may help achieve those goals. And so this work began in December of 2016. And the end results were to achieve the goal determined by the participating agencies, that there was a need to remove individuals from the system with control actions as soon as possible. And that while that was occurring in a non-linear fashion, but more in a parallel fashion, that gathering more information in order to decrease the uncertainty about the actions should also occur. Next slide. So this work was done binationally, and you'll remember that one of the results was to take action to remove individuals from the system. And so this is another example of binational action on the water. And we're no stranger to working binationally together with respect to Asian carp. Probably one of the very first on-water binational actions with Asian carp began was in 2009, where Canada participated in protecting the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. Sorry, mistake there. So the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, while the electric barrier needed to be shut down for maintenance. And so this was a very massive 500-person on-water exercise that was binational, with binational participation. So right now, as I mentioned, the current highest risk area for grass carp specifically is the western Lake Erie Basin, where there is evidence of reproduction, and where as a group, binational group, through the structured decision-making process, has decided that actions need to be taken. And so while the federal government is not a signatory to the mutual aid agreement was called, and various state provincial agencies have gone down to help, starting in 2017, get or capture grass carp. And while the federal governments are not a signatory to the mutual aid agreement, Marc mentioned earlier, all hands on deck, and Fisheries and Oceans Canada is a big believer in that motto. And so while we are not an official signatory to that agreement, we of course sent down some of our crew to go and help capture grass carp in the Sandusky River. And we've done that in 2017, and we went again this past year in 2018. This provides an opportunity to leverage those resources. All hands on deck means send as many people, boats as required, loan equipment. You can also share knowledge. You know, in Canada, we've developed what we think is a really good protocol for capturing grass carp. And I think those numbers may not necessarily reflect that sharing of knowledge in 2017, but more a reflection on having more boats out on the water, but we were able to share what protocol worked well for us in capturing grass carp. And really it comes down to the need to combine forces against a common enemy. So, Mark, I think
finally,
next slide.
yep. And so finally, law enforcement, which is critical to the effort. On the right, Becky and I have a map of the most recent bighead carp distribution. This was taken from the U.S. Geological Survey, which keeps some good records and maps of this, of not just Asian carps, but other species. And you can see that the distribution exists from the southern United States all the way up the Mississippi system, heading west and east and making its way toward the Great Lakes. There, up until relatively recently, was a vibrant trade of these fish because they serve fish markets, and that was one vector as well, besides the Chicago area, that folks were worried about the fish, the way that they could get into the system. You know, each of the states have made it illegal, and the provinces to import Asian carp and move them around. And the federal government as well is working to prevent the interstate transportation, and certainly the transportation into Canada from where these fish may be raised in the South. But law enforcement is very much a regional thing and a North American thing if we want to be effective, which also means that law enforcement officials from all over the region need to be working together and sharing information on the movement of injurious species. There is a law enforcement committee that exists in that lake committee structure that I showed you several slides ago. And it's like it sounds. It's law enforcement in fisheries getting together and working together to have a combined law enforcement effort, which includes not only training but coordination, information sharing. This is a very strong bond across the border between the U.S. and Canada and jurisdictions. A special shout out to the Canadian border authorities who have done an excellent job making busts at the border for people who have been trying to break the law and bring the Asian carp live into Ontario, for example, over the Ambassador Bridge or the Blue Water Bridge. But that requires the folks to know what they're looking for, and also to be willing to impose the fines. The province of Ontario would swoop in and make sure that the law is actually enforced. You know, you can bring them in filleted as long as you have the right permits to do it, but certainly not live. One piece of law called the Lacey Act is an enforcement tool. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, plays a big role in the enforcement of the movement of injurious species. This is a law that's more than a century old and is at least intended to prevent the interstate movement. There's been some weakening of it in the courts, but we have confidence that the intent of it is to stop the interstate transportation, and that will be enforced. So it is good news on the law enforcement as well. There's a lot of cooperation that occurs. Let us conclude with a couple of slides about challenges, and that should leave us lots of time for questions. As Becky and I tried to really impress, the multi-jurisdictional nature of the environment that we're in makes this complex in tackling the Asian carp problem and taking action. There's a lot of authorities, so on the plus side, that's a very good thing. Lots of people that have lots of tools, but it is a challenge to make sure that everybody's working together and working in the same direction. There may even be differing risk perceptions and differing priorities, which would increase complications for border blind management. But the structures that we have in place and the resources that we've made available are designed to try and reduce any sort of inconsistencies on how we perceive the problem. So the key takeaway there, of course, is that collaboration and good communications across borders is key to addressing this problem. And finally, the border blind approach allows for us to leverage the resources that we have from among the jurisdictions in terms of skills and support, people, knowledge, equipment, funds and science fill the gaps, as we say, with research, and to get a good understanding of that. I personally work, I'm a legislative liaison, so I work often in the political world, and I do believe that our elected officials on both sides of the border truly want to keep these fish out, and if they are in the Great Lakes, to take steps to manage it. It's been great to see over the course of my career the understanding of elected officials in how critical it is to deal with the invasive species problem. But all of this stuff requires good science and good justification for these elected officials who have myriad decisions to make. And it really does help when the justification for it is pretty clear and we can actually present that to it. So with that, Becky and I thank you very much for your attention and being a part of this webinar, and certainly the Invasive Species Center for hosting it. Our emails are on the bottom there, and feel free to get in touch, and I'll turn it back over to Rebecca, the moderator, to field the questions.
Thank you very much, Becky and Marc. That was great. We have just over 10 minutes for questions, and we have one that trickled in pretty early on. So it was, since Asian carp spawn in the same areas and at the same time as the common carp, has either country decided to electrofish the known carp spawning areas to remove these fish? You could also remove the habitat destroying common carp as a bonus, and that's from a Canadian spear fisherman.
Well, Marc, maybe I'll jump in. So I don't believe that they actually are spawning in the same areas per se. There are slight differences in the habitat, the spawning habitat between the two. And Rebecca, sorry, can you repeat that last part, that we would take away the habitat? It
was referring to common carp as habitat destroying, so it was just that it would be a bonus to remove both at the same time, is essentially what the question was.
Right. Yeah, so I would say that I don't think we can get quite the 2-for-1 deal as one would expect. They definitely, there are some shared habitats, but not necessarily for spawning. And you know, I think that we're dealing with two completely different points in an invasion process of, you know, I was talking about grass carp having a head start of the other Asian carp species. Common carp have had a 200-year head start as well. So in order to address the control and removal of grass carp, we would need significantly more resources than we are provided with right now.
Okay, so I think a follow-up to that was, are you electrofishing the spawning grounds early in the season?
Yes, actually. So one great thing with the Invasive Species Center, if you go onto their website and under resources and webinars, they actually keep a record of previous webinars that have been done. One of those was by David Marzin, who's my senior biologist that leads the operations field program. And so the question is directed to Canada. Take a look at how we conduct our surveillance. We are definitely electrofishing. Actually, we use 8 different gear types throughout the Great Lakes, actively searching for these species. So take a look at that webinar.
Awesome. And then with respect to the work in the Sandusky River, the decision-making framework started in 2016, so that was 2 years ago. Why does it take so long to determine the action, and haven't grass carp continued to increase in numbers since then?
Well, I think it's very difficult to pull together the resources in a way that you can feel somewhat assured that you're going to have success. And, you know, I feel a little uncomfortable speaking on behalf of Ohio because the work that would need to be done in their jurisdiction. I will say that we've had a lot of success in working collaboratively with Ohio, and there has been work underway in terms of decreasing certainty with respect to management actions. And there has been some removal of individual grass carps from that system. The key here is to work collaboratively binationally because those efforts that are occurring in the Sandusky River will directly impact us here in Canada. So we encourage that ongoing conversation to occur.
So we have another question that came in, and it is, what is the probability/risk adjusted economic benefit of avoiding introduction of Asian carp from the cause if an effective hydrologic barrier were put in place? And that's from John Anderson.
Well, Becky can speak to the risk assessment that she co-authored, but I can tell you that the folks in the Great Lakes region have often talked about it in terms of the economic risk throughout the system to a wide variety of people who would be affected, and that would range from say recreational and commercial or charter fishers to subsistence fishers, and then the less quantifiable folks who value the aesthetics or just the intrinsic value of having a healthy Great Lakes. Those are very hard to put economic values on, but nevertheless are very important. It does get into a question about economics in that, we do, I kind of concluded with a little mention about the importance of stressing the need of what we do to policymakers. And very often that does have to get couched in economic terms to get people's attention and for decision making. One of the challenges that we have is actually demonstrating with any level of certainty what that economic impact might be, because we simply don't know. They haven't arrived in the Great Lakes, and so it's the only way to really find out is if they get in, and then you can try and figure out and quantify what kind of impact. But that's something we're trying to prevent. On the other hand, people who may be affected by changes to the Chicago area waterway system, and I'm talking, maybe barge operators or the like, have a much different way of measuring economic impact because they can demonstrate a here and now to that industry versus a maybe in the future to the Great Lakes ecosystem as a whole. We know it's not going to be good, but but we do know it would be spread around and felt far and wide, but quantifying it is difficult.
The next question we have is there any effort to control the damage done in the northern Mississippi River area, or is the control more focused on the Great Lakes?
The Asian Carp Action Plan that I mentioned earlier in the presentation does include a considerable amount of research that's being done by agencies like the U.S. Geological Survey and the Army Corps and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and universities to find ways in which Asian carp can be managed. But frankly, there is not a silver bullet like there is for sea lamprey. We have a lampricide that's selective to lamprey at the concentrations that it's used, and it's been very effective in keeping the lampreys under control. There's no commensurate method for Asian carp. Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. In fact, scientists today are undertaking the same Herculean effort to find vulnerabilities that are specific to Asian carp. But we can't forget that for lamprey it took many decades to discover the lampricides, and it's possible that Asian carp could be a similar challenge. It's not difficult to kill fish, but it is difficult to do it in a selective way that doesn't cause more harm than good. The folks in the upper Mississippi, and I'll add the Ohio River, Missouri River system, they're working as well with us on this because they're in a management mode as opposed to us, at least for the big-headed carp species, in a prevention mode. And anything that we discover with respect to Asian carp control could have tremendous benefit to folks in the Mississippi and Ohio rivers and vice versa. So that's why we have some not just good interregional cooperation and collaboration, but also collaboration across regions.
Yes, just to tag on to that, I think it's important to note that for the Great Lakes that we're at a stage in the invasion process where we are focused on prevention, so not having them arrive or preventing their establishment. We aren't at a spot in the invasion process where we're controlling a population like we are with sea lamprey, but happy to hear about or happy to know of all the work that's being done looking for that silver bullet. So if we do get to that part in the invasion process, we have some tools in our toolbox to deal with control. Right now, the focus is prevention.
And I think we have time for just one more question, and that is, what fundamentally is being done differently in 2019 versus in 2018?
So I can speak on maybe on behalf of Canada, and and also flag and refer folks to the Asian Carp Action Plan from the ACRCC that Marc had mentioned. In Canada, things that are fundamentally different is that we're expanding our early detection network. So we are looking at partnering with other organizations and Indigenous communities to get more eyes on the water. Where we are in the invasion curve is preventing these species from arriving in our water. So our best bet at this point is to go out, do targeted surveys looking for them, and if we find them, is to remove them. So in order to do a better job and have greater coverage, we are expanding that network in 2019.
I think, and to add to that, on the American side, we will have a pretty intense look at the Glimmerous Brandon Road. I think a lot of eyes will be on that, getting it authorized and funded and moving forward. So that's at least in the Chicago area waterway is where a lot of our attention is going to be. And then I think a lot of it is continuing on with the groundwork that was laid with earlier action plans to move forward with the science and to continue to find ways that can be that we can use to control Asian carp to prevent their introduction in the first place and so on. So that action plan is a very good guide, and it's constantly being updated and refined and improved.
Well, that is all the time we had for questions. So I just wanted to thank you again, Becky and Marc, for taking the time to speak to us today and giving us a really great overview of the collaboration going on between the two border agencies. And I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in. I just wanted to let you guys know that the webinar was recorded, and we will be posting it on our website at www.asiancarp.ca in the next couple of days. And another reminder about the survey that will follow when you leave the webinar. If you could take a couple seconds to fill it out, we would really appreciate it. So thank you again for listening, and stay tuned for some future webinars.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you very much.